Mr. Carter, before we vote, the board needs your position. Do you believe Victor Langford should remain CEO? The question hung over the boardroom like the final number on a balance sheet. Clean, cold, impossible to argue with. 12 people sat around a polished walnut table on the 42nd floor of Northstar Systems headquarters in downtown Chicago, and every one of them was looking at me. Victor Langford sat 3 seats to my left. 48 hours earlier, he had smiled while my wife introduced me as her broke repairman. Now that smile was gone. A thick audit report rested in front of him, its black cover closed, though everyone in the room already knew what was inside. Margaret Whitmore, Northstar's lead independent director, folded her hands and waited. She was 61, silver-haired, calm, the kind of woman who could make silence feel like a legal document. I looked past her toward the glass wall separating the boardroom from the executive corridor. Lauren stood outside. My wife. Her arms were crossed tightly over the navy blazer she had worn that morning. From 30 feet away, I could still read the confusion on her face. She had spent years believing I had quietly faded out of the business world. She had told coworkers I was semi-retired. She had joked that I spent more time fixing cabinet hinges than doing anything important. And 2 nights earlier, with a room full of executives listening, she had reduced 25 years of my life to 4 words. My broke repairman husband. I hadn't corrected her. That was the part she still didn't understand. I hadn't corrected anyone. Not Victor. Not the vice presidents who laughed. Not the young director who asked whether I gave discounts on plumbing work. I had simply closed my toolbox, washed the grease from my hands in a guest bathroom, and listened. Men sometimes confuse silence with weakness because silence gives them room to hear their own confidence. Victor had used every inch of that room. He had talked about leadership, growth, discipline, and knowing when someone no longer belonged at the table. He had looked directly at me when he said the last part. Lauren had smiled into her wine glass. I remembered that smile now more clearly than anything else. Not because it was cruel. Cruelty would have been easier. It was casual, comfortable, like the idea of me being small had become normal to her. Margaret repeated my name softly. Daniel. I brought my attention back to the boardroom. Outside the windows, Lake Michigan stretched gray beneath the morning clouds. Traffic moved 40 stories below us, tiny and orderly, as if every car knew exactly where it belonged. My hands rested flat on the table. No shaking, no anger, just the steady pressure of wood beneath my palms. Michael Grant sat beside me with his yellow legal pad untouched. He had known me for 22 years. He knew I didn't need notes for this. Victor shifted in his chair. His suit probably cost more than the truck I had driven downtown, but clothes have never impressed me much. I had spent too many years around factories, machine shops, loading docks, and engineering floors to confuse polish with strength. Real systems reveal themselves under pressure. So do people. 48 hours earlier, Victor had thought I was a man who repaired things because I couldn't afford to replace them. He didn't know I had once helped save Northstar when the company was weeks from running out of cash. He didn't know my signature still sat on the original recapitalization agreement. He didn't know Carter Capital Trust controlled enough voting power to make my opinion impossible for this board to ignore. Lauren didn't know either. That part hurt more than Victor's laughter ever could. Not because I had hidden everything from her. I hadn't. Years ago, I had told her about the restructuring, the investment, the board rights, the trust. Back then she listened. Somewhere along the way, titles became more interesting to her than history. When I stepped away from daily operations, she mistook absence for failure. When I stopped wearing suits, she mistook comfort for decline. When I started repairing things around our house because I enjoyed working with my hands, she mistook competence for desperation. The strange thing was that none of that had brought me into this room. An insult wasn't enough to remove a CEO. A bad joke wasn't enough to destroy a career. Victor had done something far more serious. Something buried beneath consulting invoices, executive expenses, and vendor contracts that should never have survived basic scrutiny. I hadn't come looking for revenge. I had asked one question. That question opened a door. Behind it was a problem no responsible board could ignore. Margaret leaned forward slightly. Victor watched me. Lauren watched me through the glass. And for one quiet second, I remembered the sound of my toolbox closing at that reception. Click. Small sound. Final sound. The kind you barely notice until you realize it marked the moment everything changed. Margaret asked again. Do you believe Victor Langford should remain CEO? I looked at Victor, then at the audit report, then back toward my wife. 48 hours earlier, Lauren had called me her broke repairman. By the end of this meeting, she was going to understand exactly what I had been repairing. 48 hours earlier, I was standing on a 6-foot aluminum ladder behind our house with a screwdriver in one hand and a flashlight tucked under my arm when Lauren called my name from the patio. The outdoor cooling system had stopped working less than an hour before guests were supposed to arrive, and the August heat was still hanging over Chicago like a heavy blanket. I had already traced the problem to a failed relay inside the control box. It was not complicated. 10 minutes, maybe 15, and it would be working again. Lauren did not see it that way. "Daniel, people are going to be here soon," she said. I looked down. She stood beside the French doors in a dark blue dress, checking her phone every few seconds. "I know," I said. "That is why I am fixing it." She exhaled through her nose. "I told you we should have called someone." I tightened the final screw and closed the panel. "You did call someone." She did not laugh. Years earlier, she would have. Back then, she used to bring me coffee when I worked in the garage and sit on the workbench while I repaired whatever had broken that week. She used to say she liked that I knew how things worked. Somewhere along the way, that stopped sounding impressive to her. I climbed down, turned the system back on, and cool air began moving across the patio. Lauren barely looked at it. "Please change before anyone gets here." I glanced at my jeans, work boots, and faded gray shirt. There was a small streak of dust near my sleeve. "I will." The doorbell rang before I made it upstairs. Lauren closed her eyes for half a second. "Of course." She turned toward the house, and I folded the ladder against the wall. The first guests were already crossing the living room by the time I came inside. Northstar people. I recognized some names, fewer faces. Lauren had been with the company for almost 9 years, long enough that these gatherings had become part of our calendar. Senior executives, vice presidents, strategy directors, people who could discuss a quarterly forecast for 20 minutes without ever mentioning the factory workers whose hands made the numbers possible. I was heading toward the stairs when a tall man with silver at his temples stepped into the foyer. Victor Langford, Chief Executive Officer of Northstar Systems. I had seen his photograph in reports for years. In person, he carried himself like every room had been prepared for his arrival. Lauren appeared beside him almost immediately. Her posture changed. Shoulders straighter. Smile brighter. "Victor, I am so glad you made it." He handed her a bottle of wine and glanced toward me. His eyes moved from my shirt to my boots, then to the screwdriver still in my hand. "I hope I am not early," he said. "Looks like maintenance is still finishing up." Lauren laughed. It was quick. Automatic. I waited for her to correct him. She did not. Instead, she looked at me with the kind of smile people use when they are trying to make an awkward situation entertaining. "That is Daniel," she said. "My husband." Victor raised his eyebrows. "Your husband?" "Yes." She glanced at the screwdriver. "Although these days he is basically my broke repairman. He refuses to call a professional for anything." 2 people standing nearby laughed. Then another. Not loudly. Not cruelly. That almost made it worse. They laughed because Lauren had given them permission to. I looked at her. She was already smiling at Victor again. For a moment, I could hear only the low hum of the cooling system outside, the one I had just repaired. Victor stepped closer and held out his hand. "Well, every executive needs someone who keeps the house running." I shook it. Sometimes. His grip was firm. His attention was already drifting away. I had spent enough time around powerful men to know the difference between confidence and performance. Victor performed constantly. Every pause, every smile, every turn of his shoulders. He had practiced being the most important person in the room until everyone else had started practicing too. "What line of work are you in, Daniel?" he asked, almost as an afterthought. Lauren answered before I could. "He used to do some engineering work." "Used to." I looked at her again. She did not notice. Victor nodded politely. "Good field. Tough to stay relevant, though. Technology moves fast." "It does," I said. A woman near the dining room called Victor's name, and he turned away before the conversation had fully ended. Lauren touched my arm. "Please go change." Her voice was lower now. "You look like you came through the service entrance." I looked down at the dust on my sleeve. "I fixed the system you wanted fixed." "That is not the point." "Then what is?" She glanced toward Victor, then toward the other guests. That glance answered more than her words could have. "Not tonight, Daniel." I nodded once. "All right." I walked toward the garage instead of upstairs. My toolbox was still sitting open on the workbench where I had left it earlier. I placed the screwdriver inside and closed the lid. Click. A small sound. Clean. Final. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a message from Margaret Whitmore. She had sent it 20 minutes earlier. Daniel, the proxy materials for Monday are complete. We should speak before the board session. I read it twice, then locked the screen. Through the garage door, I could hear Lauren laughing with her guests. Victor's voice rose above the others. He was telling someone about leadership, about knowing who created value and who merely occupied space. I rested my hand on the closed toolbox and listened. I had not planned to think about Northstar that night. I had not planned to think about voting rights, board seats, or old agreements. But plans have a way of changing when people show you exactly what they believe you are. Lauren had not always looked at me like I was something she needed to explain. There was a time when she used to watch me work with the kind of attention people reserve for things they genuinely respect. We met 21 years earlier at a neighborhood fundraiser in Oak Park, long before Northstar systems meant anything to her, and long before corporate titles started shaping the way she measured people. I was 30 years old then, spending most of my waking hours between engineering meetings, machine shops, and a small office that smelled like coffee and printer toner. Lauren was 25, finishing a graduate program in business administration and working for a regional consulting firm. She asked questions about everything. Not polite questions. Real ones. How machines worked. Why factories failed. Why some companies survived bad years and others disappeared. I liked that about her. She listened to answers instead of waiting for her turn to speak. On our third date, my truck would not start outside a restaurant during a January cold snap. I opened the hood under a streetlight while snow collected on my shoulders. Lauren stood beside me holding a flashlight and laughing because neither of us had gloves. I found a loose battery connection, tightened it, and the engine turned over. She climbed into the passenger seat and said, "That might be the most useful thing any man has ever done on a date." I remembered that sentence while standing in my garage years later, listening to her entertain executives inside our house. Somewhere between those two nights, usefulness had changed meaning. At first, the changes were small enough to ignore. When I stepped away from daily operations, Lauren told friends I was taking time for myself. A few years later, she started saying I was consulting. Then she called me semi-retired. Eventually, she stopped explaining at all. If someone asked what I did, she would smile and say, "Daniel keeps busy." The first time I heard it, I almost laughed. Keeps busy. As if 25 years of engineering, acquisitions, restructuring, and investment decisions had become a hobby I performed between mowing the lawn and replacing light fixtures. I never corrected her in public. Part of that was pride, but not the kind she probably imagined. I had spent enough time in executive rooms to stop needing strangers to know my resume. Titles mattered when they gave you responsibility. They became dangerous when they became your identity. Lauren used to understand that. Then Northstar promoted her to vice president. 2 years later, she became senior vice president of corporate strategy. The invitations changed. The restaurants changed. The names around our dinner table changed. People started measuring their weeks in earnings calls, investor meetings, and hotel status levels. Lauren became good at that world. Very good. She knew when to laugh, when to agree, when to challenge someone without making them defensive. She could enter a crowded room and identify the 3 people who mattered before anyone had finished the first round of drinks. I admired the skill. What I did not admire was what it slowly did to her. She began talking about people in categories. High potential, useful connection, dead weight. Someone was either moving upward or standing in the way. One evening, after a company dinner, she told me a director had embarrassed himself by driving an 8-year-old sedan to an executive event. I asked what that had to do with his work. She stared at me as if the question itself was outdated. Perception matters, Daniel. I remember drying a plate with a dish towel and saying, "Only when people care more about the wrapper than what is inside." She rolled her eyes. That sounds exactly like something you would say. I did not understand then that it was not a joke. She was beginning to put me in the same category. My pickup became an embarrassment. My work boots became a symbol. The fact that I preferred repairing something instead of replacing it became evidence that I was cheap. When I spent Saturday mornings in the garage restoring an old radio or adjusting a cabinet door, she no longer saw patience or skill. She saw a man who had stopped competing. The strange part was that my financial life had never stopped moving. I still reviewed investment reports. I still spoke with Michael Grant. I still signed documents that affected companies Lauren discussed at dinner without realizing my name sat behind some of the capital, keeping them stable. But because I no longer wore the uniform of ambition, she decided ambition had left me. That evening, I finally changed my shirt and returned to the patio. Lauren was standing near Victor Langford and 3 senior executives. She saw me approaching, and for half a second her expression tightened. Not affection, not relief, calculation. She was deciding how my presence would look. That was when I understood the real problem. Lauren had not forgotten who I was. She had replaced me with a simpler version that fit the story she wanted to tell about herself. And once someone becomes comfortable believing a smaller version of you, the truth can feel like an inconvenience. I had been back on the patio less than 5 minutes when my phone vibrated again. I almost ignored it. Victor was holding court near the outdoor fireplace, Lauren beside him. 3 executives forming the kind of semicircle that appears whenever someone important decides to tell a story. I stood near the edge with a glass of iced tea, listening more than speaking. My phone vibrated a second time. I checked the screen. Margaret Whitmore. This time she was calling. I stepped through the kitchen and into the hallway before answering. "Daniel, sorry to catch you at home," she said. Margaret never wasted words. "The proxy materials are complete. Michael reviewed the final language this afternoon. I saw your message. There is one issue I would rather discuss before Monday." I glanced through the doorway toward the patio. Victor was laughing at something. Lauren laughed with him. "What kind of issue?" "Nothing for the telephone tonight. Governance. Executive compensation. A few disclosure questions." Her tone was controlled, but I had known Margaret long enough to hear the weight underneath it. "All right. Can you meet?" "Sunday. Send Michael the time. I will be there." "Good. And Daniel?" "Yes." She paused. "I am glad you are still paying attention." The line went quiet. I stood there for a moment with the phone in my hand. Paying attention. That was something Lauren had stopped believing I did. To her, attention meant conference calls, presentation decks, airport lounges, and a calendar crowded with meetings. Mine had become quieter. I read reports before sunrise. I reviewed quarterly statements in the garage with coffee beside me. I spoke to Michael when something required a signature and Margaret when something required judgment. I had deliberately built distance between myself and the daily machinery of Northstar. Distance was not absence. That distinction mattered. When I returned outside, a man near the bar was watching me. I recognized him after a second. Thomas Riley, one of Northstar's older directors. He had joined the board years after I stepped away from operations, but we had crossed paths twice at shareholder meetings. His eyes narrowed slightly as I approached. "Daniel Carter?" he asked. Lauren turned toward us. "You two know each other?" Thomas studied my face. "I am trying to remember." I smiled. "We met a long time ago. At Northstar." Before I could answer, Victor stepped in with a glass in his hand. "Careful, Tom. Lauren tells me Daniel escaped the corporate world years ago." Lauren smiled. "Escaped might be generous." Thomas did not laugh. His expression stayed fixed on me. "Carter," he repeated quietly, as if the name had landed somewhere in his memory but had not opened the right door yet. I changed the subject. "How long have you been on the board now?" 7 years. "Then we probably crossed paths before that." He nodded slowly. "Probably." Victor had already lost interest. "Speaking of the board," he said, turning toward Lauren, "Monday should be quick. Routine approvals, compensation package, nothing dramatic." I took a sip of iced tea. "Compensation package?" Victor looked at me with mild surprise, as if a repairman had suddenly asked about monetary policy. "Executive matters." "Of course." Lauren gave me a warning look. Victor smiled. "Do not worry, Daniel. I promise we will not make you sit through the boring stuff." "I appreciate that." His phone rang before he could answer. He glanced at the screen and stepped away. For the first time that evening, I watched him closely. His shoulders stiffened. The smile disappeared. "When did that happen?" he asked whoever was on the other end. He moved farther toward the lawn. "No, do not send anything yet. I want to see it first." Lauren continued talking to Thomas, but I barely heard her. Victor lowered his voice. I caught only fragments. "Vendor review. Disclosure. Monday." Then he noticed me looking and turned his back. "Interesting. Not alarming. Not yet. Just interesting." When he returned, the polished smile was back in place, but it sat differently now. Too carefully. He raised his glass. Sorry. Work follows you everywhere when you are responsible for a company this size. I remember, I said. He chuckled. Do you? Lauren touched his arm lightly. Daniel means from his engineering days. I looked at her. Again, she had answered for me. Again, she had made my past smaller without even realizing she was doing it. Thomas Riley did not look away. Engineering, he said. Carter Industrial, right? The patio seemed to grow quieter around me, although the conversations had not stopped. Lauren blinked. Victor turned back. I held Thomas's gaze. That was one of them. His face changed. Recognition arrived slowly, then all at once. Before he could say anything else, I lifted my glass toward him and gave the smallest shake of my head. Not here. Not tonight. Thomas understood. He closed his mouth. Victor did not notice. Lauren certainly did not. She was already greeting another guest at the door. But as Thomas walked past me, he leaned close enough that only I could hear him. Monday is going to be more interesting than Langford thinks. I watched Victor across the patio, smiling again beneath the soft lights, and wondered for the first time whether Margaret's call and his call had been about the same thing. Thomas Riley's recognition pulled me backward almost 18 years, to a time when Northstar Systems was not a polished name on a glass tower, but a company. Running out of options. Back then, I was still spending most days inside Carter Industrial Technologies, a business I had built from a rented workshop on the west side of Chicago. We started with 6 people, 2 used milling machines, and a coffee maker that leaked onto the floor every morning. I was an engineer before I was anything else. I liked systems because systems told the truth. A machine did not care about your title. A production line did not care how expensive your suit was. Something either worked or it did not. Carter Industrial grew because we solved problems other companies avoided. Automation controls, manufacturing sensors, industrial monitoring systems. Nothing glamorous. Nothing anyone discussed over cocktails. But factories needed them, and eventually enough factories needed us that 6 employees became 60, then 200, then nearly 800 across 3 states. Northstar came onto my radar during a bad winter. Their debt was climbing. 2 major customers had left. Suppliers were shortening payment terms because they were worried about getting paid. I remember reading the numbers late one night and thinking the same thing I thought when I opened a broken control box. The system was not dead. It was simply failing in several places at once. Michael Grant thought I was crazy when I told him I wanted a closer look. They could be insolvent by summer, he said. I know. Then why are we talking about investing? Because the factories still work. That was how I saw companies then. Not as logos. Not as stock symbols. As people, machines, customers, obligations, and systems that could sometimes be repaired before everyone decided to throw them away. We spent 6 weeks going through Northstar's books. The problem was not one bad product or one terrible contract. It was years of weak decisions stacked on top of each other. Too much debt. Too many executive layers. Too little attention to manufacturing. I proposed a recapitalization. New money. New credit terms. Board changes. Operational discipline. In return, Carter Capital received a controlling voting position and specific rights over major governance decisions. Michael made sure the documents were precise. I made sure the factory stayed open. That mattered more to me than the headlines. Nearly 2,400 people depended on Northstar paychecks at the time. I had walked through those plants. I had shaken hands with men and women who had worked there longer than I had been in business. They did not deserve to lose their livelihoods because executives had stopped listening to the floor. For 3 years, I was deeply involved. I reviewed budgets before sunrise. I visited plants in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. I sat through meetings where people used 20 slides to avoid admitting one simple mistake. We cut waste, refinanced debt, rebuilt supplier trust, and brought in operators who understood the difference between managing a spreadsheet and managing a company. Slowly, Northstar stabilized. Then it grew. That was when I met Lauren. She knew what I was doing then. She saw the late nights. She saw the folders stacked across our dining table. She knew there were weeks when I drove more than 1,000 miles between plants because I wanted to see problems instead of hearing them described. She used to tell me I carried too much responsibility. After we married, I started wondering whether she was right. Carter Industrial was healthy. Northstar had a capable board. The emergency was over. I had enough money. More than enough. What I did not have was time. So I made a decision that confused almost everyone around me. I stepped away from daily operations. I kept my ownership. I kept my voting rights. I kept the governance protections Michael had negotiated. But I stopped being the man everyone saw in the building. I appointed strong executives, moved my Northstar holdings into Carter Capital Trust, and let the company operate without my face attached to every decision. I wanted dinners at home, Saturday mornings, a marriage that did not have to compete with factories and airports. Lauren supported the decision at first. She said she was proud of me for choosing a life instead of chasing another title. I believed her. Maybe she believed herself then too. The irony was hard to miss now. I had stepped out of the spotlight partly because I wanted more time with my wife, and years later, she had mistaken that choice for proof that I had never belonged in the spotlight at all. Back on the patio, Thomas Riley was still watching Victor from across the crowd. Victor raised his glass and smiled as if nothing had happened. Lauren stood beside him, perfectly comfortable in the world I had once helped preserve. I looked at the Northstar logo stitched onto Victor's event jacket and remembered seeing that same symbol on a factory gate 18 years earlier when employees were wondering whether they would still have jobs by Christmas. Victor had not been there. Lauren had not been there. I had. My phone felt heavy in my pocket. Monday's proxy materials suddenly mattered more than they had an hour earlier. Not because someone had laughed at me. I had survived worse things than laughter. But because Margaret had called about governance, Victor had received a call about disclosures, and Thomas had just warned me that Monday would not be routine. 3 small signals. 3 separate wires leading into the same box. I had spent most of my life learning what to do when a system started sending warnings. You did not ignore them. You opened the panel and looked inside. Victor waited until dinner was underway to say the thing that finally changed the temperature of the night. We had moved from the patio into the dining room because the humidity had climbed and Lauren wanted everyone comfortable. 12 people sat around the long table, with Victor near one end and Lauren 2 seats from him. I was across from them, close enough to hear every word without trying. The conversation moved through the usual executive territory: expansion plans, competitors, quarterly targets, people who had been promoted, and people who had not. I mostly listened. Victor liked an audience. He spoke in polished sentences, the kind designed to sound spontaneous, even though he had probably used versions of them 100 times. The biggest mistake companies make, he said, is holding on to people who stopped being hungry. A few heads nodded. Lauren did too. Victor continued. You see it everywhere. Someone succeeds early, gets comfortable, and decides the world owes them relevance forever. His eyes moved around the table before settling on me. Some men retire early because they can afford to. Others retire because nobody needs them anymore. A few people smiled. One executive lowered his eyes toward his plate. Thomas Riley did not move at all. I set down my water glass. Lauren gave a short laugh. Not nervous. Not accidental. Comfortable. Victor noticed and leaned back in his chair. No offense, Daniel. I am speaking generally. Of course, I said. Daniel is perfectly happy, Lauren added. He has his projects. Projects. The word landed softly, which somehow made it heavier. Victor smiled. That is good. Everyone needs something to keep busy. I looked at Lauren. She was watching him, not me. Good to know what you think success looks like, I said. Lauren finally turned. Daniel. Her voice carried a warning. I did not raise mine. What? Do not make this awkward. I am not. Victor lifted both hands with an easy grin. We are among friends. Thomas spoke for the first time in several minutes. Maybe we should change the subject. Victor glanced at him, mildly surprised. Why? We are talking about leadership. Then talk about leadership, Thomas said. Not people who are not here to defend their resumes. The table went quiet for half a beat. Victor smiled again, but this time it took effort. Fair enough. He turned toward another executive and started discussing a proposed acquisition in Wisconsin. The conversation recovered. Mine did not. I looked at Lauren once more. She had already moved on. That was the moment something inside me became very clear. I was not hurt because Victor thought I was irrelevant. Victor did not know me. His opinion had no history behind it. Lauren's did. She had watched the years I worked. She had seen the flights, the factories, the negotiations, the nights when dinner went cold because a plant manager called with a problem. She had known the man before the quiet years. Yet somewhere along the way, she had decided the quiet years erased everything that came before them. I stayed another 20 minutes, long enough not to turn my exit into theater. Then I carried my glass to the kitchen, rinsed it, and picked up my keys from the counter. Lauren followed me into the hallway. Where are you going? For a drive. Now. Yes. She lowered her voice. You are being sensitive. I looked at her. Am I? Victor jokes with everyone. I'm not talking about Victor. That stopped her for a second. Then what are you talking about? You. Her expression tightened. I defended you. No, Lauren. You explain me. What does that even mean? I slipped my keys into my pocket. It means every time someone asked who I was tonight, you answered in a way that made me smaller. She crossed her arms. You are imagining things. Maybe. I opened the door to the garage, but I do not think I am. The night air outside was warm and still. I climbed into my pickup and sat without starting it. Through the windshield, the house glowed behind me, every window bright. I could see shadows moving inside, people laughing, glasses being raised. A life built on appearances continuing perfectly without me for a few minutes. Then I took out my phone and called Michael Grant. He answered on the fourth ring. Daniel? Everything all right? I have a question. Go ahead. Has Langford's executive spending always been this aggressive? Silence. Not long. Maybe 2 seconds. Long enough. Why are you asking? Michael said. Tonight he mentioned the corporate aircraft, a consulting group, and a leadership retreat in Scottsdale. None of those matched what I remember from the last governance package. Michael exhaled slowly. You remember correctly. I looked toward the house. Margaret called me about disclosure questions. Victor got a call about a vendor review. Thomas told me Monday will not be routine. Another silence. He knew what I was about to say before I said it. Daniel, he said carefully, are you asking me to look deeper? I started the truck. The engine settled into a low, familiar hum. Open the books. Michael did not waste the night. By 7:30 the next morning, I was sitting across from him in a quiet conference room above his law office near the Chicago River, a paper cup of coffee cooling beside my hand while rain streaked. The windows. He had already pulled the most recent Northstar expense reports, vendor disclosures, executive compensation schedules, and board summaries available through the channels Carter Capital was entitled to review. Nothing about the room felt dramatic. Gray carpet, white walls, a printer humming somewhere down the hall. That was usually how serious problems began. Not with alarms. With numbers that refused to make sense. Michael slid a folder toward me. Start here. The first item was an invoice from a consulting company called Meridian Strategic Partners. $285,000 for executive market positioning and leadership advisory services. I read the description twice. What did they actually do? That is the problem, Michael said. The documentation is thin. I turned the page. Another payment. $190,000. Then another. Different descriptions. Similar language. Strategic alignment. Executive development. Market expansion advisory. Words that sounded expensive without saying much. How long? I asked. Almost 3 years. I looked up. Total. A little over $1.4 million. The coffee suddenly tasted bitter. Who approved it? Michael tapped the page. Victor. Board review. Not individually. The payments were kept inside delegated spending authority and distributed across several cost centers. That bothered me more than the amount. People sometimes make poor decisions. Systems are supposed to catch them. When someone learns how to stay just below the level where questions are automatically asked, that is different. I turned another page. Northstar had paid for 2 leadership retreats in Scottsdale. The reports described them as executive planning sessions, resort accommodations, private dining, transportation, outside facilitators. Nearly $400,000 combined. How many executives attended? I asked. According to the expense summaries, 14. According to what else? Michael looked at me. Hotel records suggest 9. I leaned back. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Where did the other money go? We do not know yet. That was the phrase I hated most in any review. We do not know yet. It meant the system had a dark space inside it. Michael opened another folder. There is also the aircraft. Northstar did not own a plane. The company used a charter service for limited executive travel when commercial schedules created legitimate business problems. At least, that was the policy I remembered. The actual usage had increased almost 70% over 2 years. Some trips lined up cleanly with investor meetings and plant visits. Others did not. Phoenix on a Thursday with no scheduled Northstar event until Monday. Naples, Florida, during a week listed internally as remote strategy planning. A flight to Denver that carried only 2 passengers but appeared under a 6-person executive travel allocation. None of it proved wrongdoing by itself. That mattered. I was not going to turn suspicion into guilt because Victor had irritated me at dinner. We stay factual, I said. No assumptions. No fishing expedition designed to reach a conclusion. Michael nodded. Agreed. If everything has a legitimate explanation, we close it. And if it does not, then we follow it. At 9:12, Michael's assistant knocked and handed him a note. He read it without speaking. His expression changed just enough for me to notice. What? I asked. Ethan Brooks called. Northstar's chief financial officer. I knew Ethan by reputation more than personally. Quiet. Careful. The kind of finance executive who preferred footnotes to speeches. What does he want? He asked whether Carter Capital initiated a governance review. I looked toward the rain again. Who told him? He would not say. Call him back. Michael did. Ethan answered immediately. Michael put the call on speaker after receiving permission. Mr. Carter, Ethan said, and there was relief in his voice that made my attention sharpen. I was hoping you were involved. Why? I asked. Silence. Then a long breath. Because if you are reopening the vendor files, you should not stop with this year. Michael glanced at me. How far back? 3 years. At least. Meridian. I asked. Another pause. Yes, but not only Meridian. I leaned forward. What else? Several vendors were approved through executive exceptions. Different names. Different services. Same pattern. What pattern? Ethan lowered his voice even though he was probably alone. Invoices just under review thresholds. Contracts renewed before procurement could rebid them. Services described broadly enough that nobody could measure delivery. Michael started writing. I did not. I wanted to hear every word. Did you raise concerns? I asked. Twice. With Victor? The first time. And he said I was slowing down growth. The second. Audit committee materials. Ethan paused. The section was removed from the final package. The conference room felt smaller. Not because we had proof. We did not. Because now we had something more important than an ugly expense report. We had a control failure. Ethan, I said, do not alter anything. Do not delete anything. Do not confront anyone. Preserve the records exactly as they are. Understood. Michael will coordinate the proper process. There is one more thing, Ethan said. His voice had gone quieter. You need to check who owns Meridian Strategic Partners. Michael's pen stopped. We are doing that now. Do it before Monday. The call ended. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Michael opened his laptop, typed for less than a minute, then turned the screen toward me. Meridian Strategic Partners was registered through a private holding company in Delaware. The public trail was limited, but one name appeared on an older state filing connected to the original entity. Langford. Not Victor. Caroline Langford. Michael looked at me. Do you know who she is? I did not answer immediately. I was already reaching for my phone. Find out. 20 minutes later, he had the answer. Caroline Langford was Victor's younger sister. Caroline Langford's name changed the review from unusual spending to something the board could not afford to ignore. Michael and I spent the next 3 hours following documents instead of assumptions. Meridian Strategic Partners had received more than $1.4 million from Northstar over 34 months. But the company had no public office, no listed employees beyond a registered agent, and no history of comparable corporate work before Northstar became its largest client. That did not automatically make the contracts improper. Small consulting firms could be legitimate. Family connections could be disclosed and managed. The problem was that we could not find the disclosure. Michael searched every conflict questionnaire available to Carter Capital. Victor had answered no when asked whether he or an immediate family member held a material financial interest in any Northstar vendor. I read that line 3 times. Maybe Caroline sold the company, I said. Michael shook his head. Current ownership records are shielded through the holding structure, but the registered address still connects back to a property she owns outside Evanston. I leaned against the conference table. Then confirm it independently. Already requested. That was the rule. Verify first. Judge later. By noon, Ethan Brooks had provided preserved copies of procurement records through Northstar's legal review process. Michael brought in an outside forensic accounting team approved under the shareholder governance provisions. I stayed out of their way. I had learned a long time ago that when you ask professionals to find the truth, the worst thing you can do is tell them what you hope the truth will be. The second vendor appeared shortly after one. Alder Creek Communications. $740,000 across 2 years for executive messaging, investor narrative development, and strategic communications support. Lauren worked in corporate strategy, so I recognized the kind of language. What I did not recognize was the need. Northstar already employed an internal communications department and retained a national investor relations firm. Duplicate services, Michael said. Possibly. Who approved Alder Creek? He turned the screen toward me. Victor had signed the exception. The invoices stayed just below the amount that would have triggered additional committee review. Again, I felt that old engineering instinct tighten inside me. 1, a regular reading could be noise. 2 might still be coincidence. Repetition was where systems started telling you something. At 2:15, Ethan called again. There is another issue, he said. The Scottsdale retreats? I asked. Yes. Finance was told 14 executives attended the second retreat. Only 9 appear on the hotel rooming list. Could the others have stayed elsewhere? That is what I asked. And no supporting records. Michael asked, what about meals and transportation? Ethan went quiet. Expenses were billed for 14. I looked at the rainwater sliding down the window. Do not characterize it yet, I said. Document the discrepancy. Ethan agreed. That distinction mattered to me. A discrepancy was a fact. An accusation was a conclusion. We were not there yet. By mid-afternoon, the outside accountants had identified 7 vendor contracts that followed similar approval patterns. Broad service descriptions. Executive exceptions. Renewal timing that avoided competitive review. 3 had direct or indirect connections to people in Victor's personal network. 1 belonged to a former college roommate. Another employed the husband of a longtime family friend. Meridian was still the most serious because Caroline was his sister and the conflict disclosure appeared to say the opposite. Then Michael received confirmation from a corporate records service. Caroline Langford remained the beneficial owner of Meridian. He placed the report in front of me without speaking. I read the page slowly. There it was. Clean. Simple. Her name. Victor's certification beside it in another document. No disclosed conflict. 2 pieces of paper that should never have existed together. Call Margaret, I said. We reached her just after 4. She listened without interrupting while Michael summarized the verified facts. When he finished, she asked one question. Is there enough to convene the audit committee? Yes, Michael said. Enough to remove Victor? I answered before he could. That is not the question yet. Margaret paused. Go on. The question is whether the board has enough information to investigate properly. Removal comes after the facts, not before them. Her voice softened slightly. That sounds like the Daniel Carter I remember. I am not doing this because of Friday night. I know. Make sure everyone else knows too. They will. 20 minutes later, an emergency audit committee notice went out for Sunday morning. Victor would receive it. So would Thomas Riley. So would Ethan. Lauren would almost certainly hear about it through the executive floor before dinner. I closed the final folder and finally drank what remained of my coffee. It had gone completely cold. Michael watched me for a moment. You understand what happens now. Victor starts asking who opened the review. And eventually he finds Carter Capital. Probably. Lauren might find out before Monday. I looked at my phone. No messages from her since I had left the house the night before. Maybe. Michael closed his laptop. Are you going to tell her first? I thought about Lauren laughing at that table, about the way she had explained my life to people who had never earned the right to define it. Then I thought about something more important. She worked for Northstar. Her loyalty was already being tested, whether she knew it or not. No, I said. I want to hear what she says before she knows where I stand. That evening, when I pulled into our driveway, Lauren's car was already there. The kitchen lights were on. Through the window, I could see her pacing with her phone pressed to her ear. I had not even reached the front door when she looked up and saw me. Her expression told me the news had arrived before I had. Lauren ended the call the second I stepped into the kitchen. She did not say hello. She placed her phone on the counter and looked at me with the tight expression she usually wore before difficult meetings. Something is happening at Northstar. I set my keys beside the fruit bowl. What happened? The audit committee called an emergency session for tomorrow morning. Victor is furious. Finance is pulling vendor records. Legal is involved, and nobody will tell strategy what triggered it. Her words came fast, sharpened by frustration. I opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of water. Maybe the board found something worth reviewing. That is exactly the kind of answer people give when they have no idea how companies actually operate. I closed the refrigerator door. Is it? Yes, Daniel. Reviews like this create panic. They slow decisions. They make good executives spend their time defending paperwork instead of running the business. I twisted the cap from the bottle. Sometimes paperwork is part of running the business. She stared at me. You do not understand what Victor is dealing with. The sentence was simple, quiet. Still, it landed harder than anything Victor had said the night before. Explain it to me. Lauren folded her arms. Northstar is expanding. We are negotiating partnerships, building market share, preparing a major acquisition. Victor has spent years turning that company into something people respect. I took a drink of water. Did he? She frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Nothing. Keep going. He built the executive team. He rebuilt investor confidence. He pushed growth when everyone else wanted to play safe. Now some committee decides to tear through 3 years of expenses because somebody probably does not like the way he operates. I watched her carefully. Do you know what they are reviewing? Not specifically. Then how do you know the review is unreasonable? She looked away for half a second. Because I know Victor. Do you? I work with him every day. That was not my question. Her shoulders tightened. Why are you doing this? Doing what? Sitting there acting like you know something. I placed the bottle on the counter. I asked 2 questions. No. You are judging a world you walked away from years ago. There it was again. Walked away from. The phrase Lauren had repeated so often that it had become history in her mind. You really believe that, do you not? I said. Believe what? That because I stopped sitting in an office every day, I stopped understanding business. She let out a tired breath. Daniel, I am not trying to insult you. That usually comes right before an insult. I am trying to be realistic. Then be realistic. She stepped closer to the kitchen island. Fine. Men like Victor create value. They make decisions. They take risks. They build companies. They do not spend their days fixing faucets and restoring old radios because they have nothing better to do. The room went still. The refrigerator hummed behind me. Somewhere outside, a lawn sprinkler clicked across the neighbor's yard. Small ordinary sounds continuing as if nothing important had just happened. I looked at Lauren and realized the dinner had not been a misunderstanding. The joke had not slipped out because she was nervous around her chief executive officer. She admitted. Maybe not every word, but the belief underneath it was real. There it is, I said. There what is? The truth. She rolled her eyes. Please do not turn this into some dramatic marriage argument. I am not. My voice stayed level. I am listening. To what? To how you see me. Lauren opened her mouth, then stopped. I continued. Last night you told people I used to do engineering work. Tonight you told me men like Victor build companies while men like me fix faucets. That is not what I said. It is exactly what you said. She rubbed her forehead. You are taking everything personally because you are embarrassed. I was embarrassed last night. I paused. Tonight, I am disappointed. That finally made her quiet. I walked past the kitchen island toward the hallway. Where are you going? Garage. Of course. I stopped, but did not turn around. You know what the strange part is, Lauren? She said nothing. You keep using that room as proof that I stopped matching. You never once asked what I do in there. I went downstairs and turned on the workbench light. The old radio I had been restoring sat beside a row of neatly arranged tools. I moved it aside and reached beneath the bench for a small fireproof document box I had not opened in years. Inside were old contracts, trust records, board agreements, and one thick folder with Northstar systems printed across the front. I carried it to the bench and opened it. The recapitalization agreement was exactly where I remembered. My signature sat near the bottom of the final page. Daniel Carter. Carter Capital. Voting control. Board appointment rights. 18 years reduced to black ink on white paper. My phone vibrated. Michael had sent one message. Emergency board meeting confirmed for Monday. Morning. Margaret wants you present in person. I looked upstairs toward the faint sound of Lauren moving around the kitchen. She had chosen her side without knowing there were sides. I closed the folder slowly. For years, I had believed keeping my old world separate from our marriage protected something valuable. Now I understood silence had protected the wrong thing. It had protected an illusion.